This is On Diversity, a podcast series by the Institute of Policy Studies, Singapore. This is the first episode of the second season, and I'm your host, Liang Kai-Sing, Associate Director of IPS and a former journalist. Today's episode is on conversations about race, and we are going to have a conversations about race with our two guests today. First, we have Dr. Daniel Goh. We should be quite familiar with him. Daniel Goh is Associate Professor of Sociology and Associate Provost of Undergraduate Education at NUS. He specialises in race issues and multiculturalism. He was also a Workers' Party NCMP but has retired from political service. We also have Haresh Tilani. He's the co-founder and creative director of Ministry of Funny, and his podcast series Yalla Bud is one of the top podcasts in Singapore. Welcome to the podcast today. We are talking about race, and it's always really sensitive. So how should we approach or start conversations related to race? Who should we go first?
Haresh?
Sure. I guess I think the biggest barrier is that there's still this sort of, sentiment that these sort of conversations are very hard to have, very taboo, hence we should not have it. That was actually one of the reasons why we started our podcast and we named it Yalla Bud, because when we were looking at the articles and the videos that were being shared on media, it was always just one opinion, and then whatever back and forth happens in the comments, and then sometimes it just degenerates into very, very malicious and vile discussions. And it always struck me as why are no long-form conversations happening more often? You rarely see that on TV, or even on TV, on radio, the interviews tend to be very short, but sometimes to get to the heart of a matter, you need to go deep, and you need to be chatting for a long time. So for me, I think it's encouraging now that we're seeing more of those conversations. For example, this podcast, I can't imagine this happening maybe 5 years ago. And I think people need to be open to having these sort of uncomfortable conversations and knowing that you can have a difference in opinion, but doesn't mean that you hate the other person just for having that opinion. And I think that's something that I still myself struggle with. I think a lot of people do.
Okay. How you mentioned about TV shows and all that? I think in the past, we don't really have conversations about race because it's sort of against the law. Prof, can you tell us more about it?
It's not so much against the law, but I think it was a taboo. And it was the norm to, try not to talk about race and other sensitive issues, because that was the historical kind of context, right, that our older generations, our parents lived in. They experienced the racial riots, right? It was direct violence, right, in their face. So they understood that, any sensitive issues should be avoided in public. Anything to be discussed in the back room and settled in the back room. Yeah.
But not only just that, right? Because there's always, talks about if you talk about this, we'll call police and all that. I
think that's just a threat. There's the sedition law that's there, in which if you create disharmony between communities and so on, so you can be charged under sedition law. That's that, but not many people are charged under sedition law for this kind of activities. It's more a sensitivity that's born out of historical experience and biographical too, right? Because a lot of them experience these racial issues up front and direct. Yeah, and I just want to second what Haresh said just now. We need all these long-form conversations today, because I think we are starting to forget our history. And it's very unlike our parents and our older generation, because they had that history, they experienced that history firsthand. We don't, right? So we need to, I think, kind of rediscover our own histories and also our biographies. So I was very happy, for example, when a bunch of students interviewed me for a project, and the first question they asked me, "What is your heritage?" I was shocked. It was the first time I get that phrase here, right? What is your heritage? What do you mean? Oh, just your background, your family background, ethnicity,
but you are like Chinese and all that.
It's not just that. It's never that simple. I'll say, I started explaining Teochew. My grandparents come from China in 1920s because of the Civil War there, and so on and so forth. It becomes complex, and I think that's the beautiful part. We need those complex, long form conversations. Yeah,
that's cool. That's cool. But Haresh, you also talk about race in your podcast, right? Were you worried that you will get into trouble?
I would say that because, our history is we've been creating content since 2014, I think, and thankfully we haven't been cancelled yet. We like talking about race through comedy, and I think we put in a lot of effort to know which are the lines that if you cross, it almost defeats the purpose of having the conversation. Because there's no point saying something very speculative, very controversial, but at the end, you cause more problems and you take away from the discussion itself. So whenever we talk about topics, we make sure that we are as balanced as possible. We try not to speculate. How we think of our podcast is that we're just two people trying to understand the world. So how we try and understand is publicly available information, which is why sometimes we can be very critical of like newspapers or speeches and all, because if you put it out there in public, it feels like it's fair game for us to talk about. So we never talk about things we hear, and we also try and be balanced. So between our podcast is me and my co-founder. He's Chinese, I'm Indian. So there's a minority-majority balance, right? So we try and keep each other in check as well, and try not to shy away from taking an unpopular opinion just because it is unpopular. And I think that's where social media is not the best. If I were to post something unpopular on Facebook, I will get crapped on.
Lots of comments, angry comments.
Yeah, and sometimes just by sharing that, you open up the discussion for someone else to counter that, and then you kind of take away from, or you learn or you evolve from that. I think that is lacking in this kind of ping-pong nature of social media where someone puts out an opinion, everybody gets pissed, and then just go. So through conversation, right, sometimes we say stuff that if we take in isolation will be a big problem. But because there's that counterbalance, and because over the span of 1 hour, we ourselves can change our opinion, I think the podcast audio long-form format is a very constructive place for these sort of conversations, which previously you wouldn't get in a 3-minute YouTube video. You wouldn't
get
in a
There's
too
no
short.
nuances and all, right?
Yeah, and then when you see some videos, they just push people further apart. And that to me is something like, okay, are you really helping the conversation or are you causing more polarization?
However, you mentioned about social media, so I'll get to this. So, you mentioned that, there's a lot of comments and all that. So, Daniel, what's your take about this? Is social media like advancing our conversations about race, or is it just making everyone angry?
Well, it's a platform, it's a media. It's just like when the printing press first appeared in Europe in, 15th century, and you have different versions of Christianity starting to appear and the Protestant movement started. So very similarly, it's both a plus and a minus. It opens up space, discursive space for all of us to speak our mind and to, debate with each other, exchange views. But the problem, as, Haresh pointed out, it because of the nature of the platform, where you put comments in and you respond to comments in threads, they are not, that they're isolated in how echo chambers, right? It does create a kind of polarizing effect. So while it opens up space, it opens up a lot of fragmented spaces that are very polarizing. So I think that's the danger in it. How do we unify and bring conversations across these boundaries and across these spaces? I think that's a crucial thing.
But I think it's also about the algorithm, right? When I was a journalist, we realized that the more provocative your Facebook post is, the more controversial it is, the further it travels, right? And more comments it is, that the more people will see it. So maybe, social media also has a hand to play when, it further pulls people apart.
Well, I think that can interact with mainstream media. And I think we do have a system here in Singapore where, you have all these social media controversies that blow up and then it kind of carries on. And then at some point in time, you have public figures coming in to chime in, right? Using mainstream media and maybe also using social media and using IPS platforms.
Yes, that's right.
All the forums, everything.
Yeah, you're on our race forum, right?
Exactly. So and that gives a certain closure. And I think that closure, that unifying closure, and it's not a closure as in like, you stop talking now, right? It's more like, okay, let's sit back and talk about these and then have some kind of, understanding, a common understanding, a consensus. Then we move on to the next conversation or to the next iteration of the conversation. And then it carries on. Right? So that like the kind of race discussions have died down a little bit, right, since the beginning of the year. But it's going to start rising again. Right? So it's going to be the ebb and flow. And hopefully the ebb and flow is a progress.
Yeah. We do see it's sort of driven by incidents, right? So earlier this year, there was the Polytechnic lecturer, right? It was scolding the couple. And after a while, there was also the PA incident also, right? And and
before that, the brown face issue.
Right.
That
was quite bad. Yeah. But so, every time this happens, right, then we always see the minorities get very angry. And then I guess for the Chinese, we are sort of like the majority and all that. And I see around two kind of response. One is like, we are sympathetic. That's one kind, right? Then the other kind will be like, we all shouldn't keep stirring this up. Yeah. So what do you think about this? I mean, maybe Harish can go first.
I would say, I think so. That's where social media is horrible, lah. Yeah, because I think I can, how you say, so like on between me and my teammate, there are certain times in the past where I think he has also kind of shared his perspective coming from the majority race, and I've shared my perspective coming from the minority race, and somehow we meet in the middle, lah. For example, even my thoughts on the term Chinese privilege has evolved. And I can share more on that later. But I think on social media, those two threads that you mentioned, those two sentiments, to me, they are very, very almost like, it's too brief a sentiment, because I can imagine the fatigue, right? Even I myself feel the fatigue. I'm like,
again, I'm so tired of it.
Yeah, like how is this still happening? So part of me thinks there will always be racist people, and when this kind of stuff happens, it's like, okay, it's like rain. Every month it'll rain. This is like rain, which I know is a very, very pessimistic way of looking at it. But I can imagine people having fatigue. But I think if you share it on social media, there's no way through comments you're going to be enlightened, lah. Because
they'll just be like, oh, this sucks,
yeah,
right?
Because there are reasons why I think it is important that we keep stirring up and getting angry, because the problems seem to be happening, and nothing is changing, So I think to answer your question, I think those sort of sentiments, I can sort of understand the reason for both, but what I feel is lacking is understanding why they feel like that, and maybe kind of the discussion to help people understand each other's sentiments. And I think on social media, the moment someone starts with, it's the minorities again, you can tell what school of thought they belong to, and there's no way they're going to change their mind, or very unlikely that they'll change their mind just through social media. Yeah, so that's when I see it also, I'm like, even recently with the Deepavali celebration, the Indian head shake, there was that one fitness
that's the
video.
latest one.
And in my mind, I'm like, how is this still happening?
Yeah.
So that was my perspective as a minority. I'm curious what you guys think of as the majority.
Daniel, what's your thoughts about this?
I was just saying that everyday racism, casual racism, it's going to be there. Right, and it's kind of like the last frontier of trying to get rid of racism, because it's all the prejudices that we have, whether it is socialized or we or inbred or whatever, it's going to come out once in a while, right? So everyone is going to be guilty of this, right? And I think the problem here is that when it gets captured on social media and it gets spread out, something that is localized, something that happens every day, which should lead to apologies and forgiveness on the ground, becomes a public incident. And that's where the danger, it spirals out of control. My other worry is that we focus too much on these kind of racism. We forget, I think, the larger issues, the structural racisms that exist out there. Right? And these could be things like job discrimination, for example, employment, rental housing, or other kind of important issues that are missed out, because we are focused on all these symbolic kind of
So
racisms.
I think you mentioned about Chinese privilege. So I'm going to direct this at Daniel, because I think you were sort of a victim earlier when you talked about Chinese privilege at one of our IPS event and got quite a lot of bad comments.
I think it has been a useful phrase that's used in the public realm, to highlight certain advantages that the majority, race have in Singapore. But whether it is useful as an academic concept, and that was where I was coming from as an academic, and being used as a concept to analyze certain things. My argument was that we have terms like racial discrimination, racial prejudice, racism, that are already there. Structural racism, for example, casual racism. What is the advantage of using Chinese privilege as a concept? And to kind of say that, okay, we do have Chinese privilege because of, let's say, the GRC system or whatever system that it is institutionalized in Singapore, is a very lazy and shortcut way of doing proper analysis, right? So that's my academic argument. My other argument with regards to the public usage of Chinese privilege, I think it is useful to highlight and conscientize and to make ourselves kind of sensitive to certain advantages, but to use it as a blanket term, right, to throw it at anyone based on their race, right, on their skin color, is dangerous, because that's exactly the kind of basis that we want to move away from. Identification, accusations, allegations based on race. Yeah.
Okay. But I guess it's because white privilege is widely used in US
Yes,
and the world, right? So naturally it will sort of resonate amongst the people in Singapore.
It is used,
also.
but we also forget that it's critically used and also criticized a lot by minorities in the US, by Black Americans, for example, who argue that this term actually is used a lot by white people in a narcissistic way, rather than to help them in their actual causes of
As in, white people say, "Hey, I have white privilege."
Yeah, and then they go into this apology and so on and so forth. And that happens a lot. So you actually have a lot of Black authors writing about these things and how the Black movement and their struggles on the ground, right, about the kind of socioeconomic hardships are ignored in the process. It's supposed to help, right? But it becomes, in social media, it becomes a discourse that becomes very inward-looking, right, and narcissistic, instead of trying to help the actual Black movement on the ground. Yeah. So we must be aware of these kind of things.
Okay. But I think, is there a difference between like how the young and the old perceive this Chinese privilege issue? Because, I mean, there were some ministers and even PM himself alluded that back in the 60s, 70s, those who are educated in Chinese, they don't really have this Chinese privilege in a way. Yeah, but I guess when it comes down to like, the year 2021, when most people, the young people, they are bilingual and all that. So perhaps they will perceive it very differently.
I mean, I want to hear what Harish has to say about this. But just let me very quickly. I think instead of talking about Chinese privilege, we should talk about privilege.
Sure.
As a whole, right? And talk about the different privileges like class, race, gender, language use, and so on and so forth, affords a person advantages. And we can then tease out, I think, the kind of social inequalities that exist in Singapore. And I think that's more important and more inclusive in a sense, so that everyone can understand the different advantages that different groups of people have in relation to each other. Yeah.
Sure. Harish?
So earlier I mentioned that my thoughts on Chinese privilege have also evolved. So I would say my starting point was like, okay, this exists. This is a problem and it needs to be rectified. And I wouldn't say I was as angry about it as some people I see on social media. But how it has evolved is that I actually see how it can be more destructive and more of a distraction. So I agree with you, Daniel, that I think as a term, it maybe doesn't do what it set out to do at this point. So I've come to prefer a term that is more like majority privilege, which is not ascribed to a particular race. And if I were to post what I just said on social media, right, I will be like, there will be a lot of people who would go against me, saying I'm a disappointment to minorities, I'm a disappointment to Indians, which I have been called, which I think is ridiculous. But I think that is an example that immediately puts people on the defensive. Can you imagine if I walked into the studio today and I'm like, you guys reached earlier because you all have Chinese privilege. It's ridiculous, right? It's ridiculous. But that is a worry of mine, that it's seen like just because you are of a certain race, you are immediately assumed to have that privilege. And of course, there are systemic issues, which I think Daniel alluded to, but to immediately ascribe that to every Chinese person, I feel it will put them on the defensive. Generally, I know that's a broad term, but then it feels like the conversation is more about who's right versus the actual problem itself. At the same time, I think it is a term that we cannot just push away and ignore. And the example I will give is the speech by PM Lee. I get how, as a layman, he was trying to explain that there's no systemic Chinese privilege, right? And he qualified that by going back in the 60s and 70s. But I think he or whoever else worked on the speech kind of ignored the social weight of that phrase. And after he mentioned that, when I read the transcript, it gave me a very different picture from what the headlines communicated. The headline was all about PM Lee says Chinese privilege does not exist. Headlines in Singapore, headlines abroad. And that to me is like, okay, he said it, but his definition of Chinese privilege is different from what Chinese privilege is on Instagram or TikTok. And I think that sort of disconnect, ultimately, the next few days, everything was about that statement as opposed to some of the quite progressive things he mentioned in that speech. And that to me was an example of what I said earlier, where it takes away from the actual thing being discussed. So the term is a term that I feel now it's a difficult term. And even when we speak on our podcast, the moment my co-host says something that, okay, he doesn't agree with the term Chinese privilege, even our own listeners who are our fans will push back. And that's why I feel, okay, then it becomes very difficult to talk about race. And that is, to me, something that's destructive more than constructive at this point. Yeah.
Okay, let's move a little bit towards, I think just now we were mentioning social media, right? And we were mentioning more about like the news kind of social media and all that. But nowadays there were quite a few anonymous Instagram accounts and all that. And we see a lot of people contributing, talking about their experience, like, I had been discriminated as a tenant. So as a Chinese person myself, when I look at all these Instagram posts, I feel very emotional. I feel very, very sad about it. But why I feel sad about it, I wonder if this is like perpetuating like certain racial issues, or is this a safe space for minorities to, tell their stories?
You mean on social media? As an anonymous person?
Yes.
Maybe Daniel can go
Ping pong.
Ping pong, yeah, the ping pong. Yeah, I can't be serving twice.
Well, I think it is a safe space. And I think that we should all try to listen with some sympathy and empathy. And I don't think there's much harm, because I think we should let all these stories come out as much as possible. But we don't have to take them, as hard facts. Hard facts in which we then build policies on, and then, we act upon, right? But we tell stories, but you allow outlets for this to tell stories so that people can understand better, I think, the kind of, not just everyday racism, but the kind of structural racisms that exist in the system, right? Whether it is in employment or in rental housing or whatnot. And then so that people can be more conscious and be more aware of their actions. I think it's fine. It doesn't, I think, create the impression that the racial issues are so bad and so almost like a pandemic level in which we had to act upon, right? It just shows that racism is endemic, right? And we have to be more conscious. We have to be more aware of these things to try to remove it from our everyday lives. Yeah.
Okay. That sounds like COVID, actually.
It does. It is living with a bad virus.
Yeah.
Haresh?
I think yeah, it's always good to hear stories. It's always good that stories come to light. But I think where I'm more cautious is the anonymous aspect of these sort of stories, because I think that while it allows people who maybe are feeling like are not ready to publicly show themselves, to share their stories, it allows that mechanic to be taken advantage of, where stories can somewhat be embellished or fabricated or just speculative, and I think that is a very tricky line to navigate, and I don't know, because if you ask me, I appreciate social media being there for that purpose. It gives people a voice, but the dark side of it is what scares me a lot, because recently also we saw that even in Parliament, when things are fabricated, when things are not the absolute truth, it causes a lot of problems, right? And once you add anonymity, it just opens up the possibility of that happening.
Right. Yeah. I mean, definitely. I think especially parliamentarians and policymakers should stay clear of using these things as hard facts, right?
Yeah.
It is, I think, exists within the social media as for us to kind of understand the general situation, but don't use it as hard facts and to quote it as evidence, to build and make laws based on it. Yeah.
Yeah. But that's tricky, because
that's tricky,
to verify an account, it's almost like if someone has been traumatized by something, the last thing they want to hear is like, okay, can you prove that it's true?
Yeah.
And there was a Malay man who posed as a Chinese woman, right? I mean, I guess that was...
Yeah.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Sharon Liu in
Sharon Liu,
Yes.
Sharon Liu.
Yeah.
So that also creates the problem, right, of trying to weaponize it. And maybe he wasn't weaponizing it, he was doing satire.
I feel like he was trying to make a...
Like a satire, maybe?
Yeah, satire, but it just went wrong.
Satire that highlights race issues, right? But it went wrong, right?
Yeah.
And these are the kind of effects that we have to be aware of. Yeah.
So I think what Daniel said is the most important thing, that just because we see it on social media doesn't mean it's true. But I think there's human nature, just based on the number of messages I get WhatsApped from my family WhatsApp group and all. Sometimes things are taken as fact too easily. And I think even younger people are very susceptible to that. Because sometimes some things are nice to believe that is true. And I think that is the tricky part. Ideally, everybody be able to tell fact from fiction, but that's tough.
Or sometimes when it's very emotional, right? Then you tend to jump to conclusions.
Yeah,
also, right?
Exactly.
Okay. So Daniel, just wanted to go back to one part because after a lot of race discourse this year, right? I think the government also decided to have a racial harmony law, to sort of make things more open so that people can discuss without being charged with sedition. So what are your thoughts about it? And can you tell us more about this law?
I think it's a good move. I mean, the sedition law was very blunt, right? It allowed basically the government to, crack down on certain discourses if they don't like. I mean, they don't do that because they know the repercussions of doing that over time. But the racial harmony law, I mean, we do not know the exact form of it yet, but it looks like it's going to be a lot more targeted, a lot more defined, and I think that's progress. It's almost akin towards, leaning towards a hate speech law, right?
Okay, so it's more like giving us more leeway to speak and all that. I think there's one counselling component, right? Or,
Yes. Yeah. So instead of jail and everything, we counsel the person so that they won't, I mean, a lot of this has to do with awareness and education, right? So, and if we don't do racial awareness, multiculturalism kind of education in schools, then we will have to use kind of remedial kind of actions like this. Yeah.
Okay. Harish, do you think it will make a difference?
I think it's a step in the right direction. I don't know, because it's still not fully specified yet, right? The actual details. So I think it's a step in the right direction, but I'm going to hold my optimism until there's more details about it. Because I think one thing that I always find weird is, okay, this is a policy, this is a new law that's being passed, but sometimes the biggest culprits of casual racism is the government themselves. You mentioned the PA issue. So I'm not saying the whole government, I'm saying people within the government. So that's where I feel like, okay, will the law also be applied to the people who passed the law? So those are the kind of questions I have. Because I think one thing that I always hear is that the citizens have to take the step to integrate with foreigners. The foreigners have to take the step, and there's a lot of responsibility placed on the individual. But I think on the policymakers, on the people in power, there needs to be a acknowledgement that, okay, there are certain things in place that are also not helping the situation. Certain actions are not helping the situation.
Okay. But I think you alluded to some policies also, right? I think there's also the CMIO, the HDB ethnic integration policy and all that. Do you see all this going away in the long term or short term period?
I don't see it going away. Yeah.
Okay. Because
it has been very useful for us.
Okay.
Right. It creates a certain stability. I mean, there's a lot of argument against the ethnic integration policy for HDB. It's the margins of the policy is an issue. People who can't sell their flats getting stuck, and they are the minorities, right? I think that can be solved in a more targeted way, but we need the policy, I think, for one simple reason. I'm an urban sociologist too, and we see around the world, if we don't have such a policy, you find gentrified areas and ghettos forming. And we're actually talking about monetary value here. We will see, estates becoming racialized and ethnicized. And then you will see the difference in property value precisely if we remove this kind of policy. Yeah. So it is a structural issue. And the analysis has to be done at the city level.
Yeah. So I mean, the government is always saying that, if we don't have this policy, this block will be all of a certain race.
It's not just block; it will be the whole estate. I think that's scary. For it's not just about racial relations for me. It's also about the class issues that will emerge. Like you will have in Paris the outskirts, the banlieues, being dominated by Arabs, for example, and they're stuck there. They can't get out because the property values are just doesn't allow them to move. We don't want this kind of suburbs and ghettos forming. Yeah.
So if I could just ask a question, because I think right now the CMIO model, I think it has purpose, and I think while we can aspire for it to go away, I think in the near future, I think there's more benefit than disadvantages. But that's coming from me as a layman. But Daniel, you mentioned just now that just by your statement, I think if you were to say stuff like that publicly, it can be quite sensitive, lah.
Sure.
In the sense. So how, in your experience, should we navigate things like that? Because I can see what you're saying. I agree that there are certain negative consequences that could happen, like, certain ethnic concentrations. But just by virtue of saying that, it's some way saying, okay, people of a certain ethnicity are of a certain socio-economic tier. So how to have discussions like that? Because that can be very incendiary,
by facts and figures, because it is there. Right,
Yeah,
it is
yeah.
there. So we do have all these facts and figures that show that the median income in terms of social inequality, class inequality exists between ethnic groups too. And this is actually very much recognized and institutionalized. I mean, the fact that Mendaki was set up in 1980 to try to resolve this, before the other like CDAC and SINDA was formed, it's already indicative that the problem was already recognized a long time ago.
But
somehow,
I agree with Haresh that it's really, really sensitive.
Sure,
how do we talk about it without hurting?
Yes.
But I think
our
what Daniel
fellow
just said, there's a point, and I think that is often lost. Like, if you were to talk about it publicly, that almost feels secondary. The headline would be, so and so said this. But I do agree that there are facts, and I think the facts need to be given more attention and more leeway to as the marker of the direction we should go, lah. Right.
Okay. Yeah, I think we are almost there. Do you have any last bits to add?
I mean, from like for Daniel, there's a lot of research you've been doing over these issues, right?
Yeah.
But how, in your opinion, has things changed over the past 10, 15 years? Because
a lot.
For me, when I was younger, I didn't care about these sort of matters. I think it's only lately, as I get older, as I'm immersed in the media industry, I understand, okay, media content, there's a responsibility. But for you, you've been researching for a long time, right?
Yeah, I'm approaching 52. So
Oh, you don't look it, you don't look it.
Yeah, you don't look it.
Yeah.
So how has your thoughts changed over this year?
Yeah, it's changed a lot. I mean, even just in terms of my own academic work and discussion of race issues and so on and so forth. I think about 15 years ago, I was considered too radical in espousing certain kind of like critical analysis of multiculturalism, of racial issues, and so on and so forth. But today, I'm seen as moderate. So I think that has changed, right? It has shifted. In that, and I think that the reason for that is because precisely racial issues now are less sensitive to talk about. Right? People are more willing to talk and to debate and discuss. Right? I mean, we need to keep the temperature down, of course, right? But the fact that the discourse has opened up, right, and the space has opened up for different voices to emerge to discuss the issues, I think that's great progress. Yeah, previously we don't have that.
But what about the sentiments of the people you interact with? Because there's one side about your own thoughts and perspectives, but the people, the general climate of academia, of academic institutions, the students, how has that?
It's good because everyone is more open to talk about it and more aware. Right, so even in my classes, if I say, okay, no, if I call out certain kind of a bullying or prejudicial kind of words being used, the students will clap and say, yes, Prof, we respect you for that. You must enforce it. So I think students have become a lot more progressive in that sense. Whereas in the past, people just let's just try to avoid the issue.
Sure.
Right,
sure.
Let's sweep it under the carpet as much as possible. But people are more aware. People are more sensitive. I think the worry now, I think, is polarization, and people using these issues as to use the term virtue signaling, right? So that they show that they are woke, they're more progressive, and they are not amenable to like conversation. I think we must always remember in the Singapore DNA, right, is that we talk. Right, I mean, people say that, we should try to do more and talk less, right? This is the Singapore way, it's being practical. Yes, the practical thing for this thing is to talk more. And we have conversations. We don't just try to speak louder and interrupt the other. We converse. We have that ping pong thing, right?
Actually, when you talk about being woke, right, I see it as a positive thing in the sense that, like, some of my friends, they used to crack like really nasty racial jokes. So I feel like because of the recent discourse and all that, they became a bit more woke and they became more self-aware to, not say jokes that they will hurt people's feelings.
I have an allergic reaction when you say woke. You know why? Because for me, it's cultural appropriation.
Okay.
The black movement invented that term for a specific purpose in the US. I studied in Michigan, which is near Detroit. And I had, and for me, I respect that term a lot. And for me, it represents, the black movement's kind of struggle in the US. Civil rights, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, and so on and so forth. I do not want to culturally appropriate that for my situation here.
I think it's already appropriated here. Everyone's using it.
I would criticize young people who claim they work precisely on that ground.
Sure.
Right? What about our own history? Right? We should be aware. Yes, we should be aware of our own racial issues and so on and so forth. But let's be aware that we don't have to use a black American lens to look at our own situation. We have our own history, our own struggles, our own decolonization, our own post-colonial kind of situation. We should draw from our own intellectuals, our own people. Yeah.
Maybe I would like to push back a bit because I think when people talk about it as like, oh, this is from US and all that, right? I think a lot of discourse will be like, oh, but English is from the West too. Democracy is from the West too. We do hear a lot of it on social media and all that. So, I mean, how do you react to this?
Well, English is not really from the UK. So it's not from America.
I mean, the West in general.
Well, French was the more common language and universal language at one point of culture. But I think the point is that these things travel, ideas travel, right? And one could argue that the first democratic revolution happened in Haiti rather than in France, where the slaves rebelled and took over and declared a republic. But the point is that these terms move around. And Singapore is the greatest example of us always borrowing things, terms, and then using it for our own, and then turning it into something that's beautiful on our own, right? Like the word garden city. It's a concept that was invented by a UK, urban planner, right? So it was then adopted by us, and then we use it in our own way, right? So same. We can borrow all these different terms, things like privilege and so on and so forth, but adapt. That's the key thing. Yeah, don't just import and just say that, just because you just do a very simple equivalence. If you're Chinese and you have yellow skin, you're white, right? And then if you're dark, you're black, right? I think that's too simple. Yeah.
But the downside of that, okay, so let's say someone, how do students react when you kind of challenge them for using the term woke?
I'll ask them to define it.
And then what do they say?
They can't quite define it. And then I'll start singing the Rage Against the Machine, Wake Up.
Rage Against the Machine.
Oh, hey, you're a cool teacher, man.
Yeah, do they even know Rage Against the Machine?
Probably not.
I love Rage Against the
will.
Machine. No, but so then what is the downside of using this term if it kind of gets good conversations going? If it
I think it's great, yeah.
Yeah, so is
I think it's fine.
Then the downside would be for you, it's almost like, okay, there's something that we can that can bubble up from our own experiences.
Yeah. I think the question is, how do you use it, right? So if you say I'm woke, you're not woke, and then basically I'm superior to you. I think that's when you get the defensiveness.
Okay.
And then it stops conversations.
Yeah.
I think to start a conversation is fine. Even like using the word Chinese privilege, right? Okay, let's start talking about Chinese privilege.
Yeah.
I think it's very useful.
Yeah.
Right, but not saying that you have Chinese privilege. That's very different. Yeah.
I see. Okay. So it's almost the labels and that is the issue, which I also agree.
Yeah.
The term, I mean, what you mentioned, virtue signaling.
Yeah.
You see that a lot on social media.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh,
But
that's interesting.
I think just now you mentioned about polarization, right? So on one hand, you have some people that's doing the virtue signaling and all that. But on the other hand, there could be the other group of people who totally is against the woke culture or totally is against all these people. I think we do see that quite a lot playing out.
That can also be virtue signaling. Right? To say that one is anti-woke and so
yeah,
right?
we see people who are anti-woke also.
I think the solution to that is that in future, for the maintenance of racial harmony, right, one of the punishments should be you're locked in a room with someone of another race and you have to record an hour-long podcast and just talk.
I think.
Yeah, because, okay, honestly, you brought up the issue of earlier this year, the Polytechnic lecturer, right?
Sure.
I honestly would like to sit down with him to understand his experiences that led him to have that sentiment.
Yeah.
But right now, everybody just knows him as that Polytechnic lecturer. Yeah. And I think just by accepting the fact that racism will always exist, it's important we understand why people have that sentiments. Because, I mean, who knows what his history is? I still totally disagree and I find it disgusting, the things he said. But we need to understand why it bubbles up. But that conversation never happens. And I would imagine when we have brought somewhat controversial people as guests on our podcast, we were kind of getting feedback, how can you give these people a platform? But to me, it's like if there's someone who just shares such a different worldview, it's better that we try and understand, because those people will always exist. And yeah, so I think having a conversation with him would be great, lah. But I can't imagine any mainstream media publication doing it.
I think it might be quite difficult.
It can be part of the law, lah.
Yeah,
You make it
it's part of the law, exactly.
So that instead of counselling between two, the counsellor and the person, you have a podcast.
Yeah, a podcast, exactly.
Like four people, sit around, all different races, talk about racism.
It's considered a punishment, right?
Yeah. And I mean, in some way, it just forces people to talk, because it's a lot easier to be hateful when you don't have to face the person.
Yeah.
And I mean, I myself have received a good amount of xenophobic hate back when we were first starting, and maybe our brand wasn't as well known. Making videos, people were telling me, who is this Indian from this Indian village? Go back to your village. And I'm like, oh my God. But then, and I think it's because these people don't have to sit down and tell it to me, to my face. Yeah,
definitely. I would like to thank my guests today, Daniel and Haresh, for their time today. Thank you all for listening in. See you on the next episode of On Diversity.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. On Diversity is a podcast inspired by the Institute of Policy Studies Managing Diversity's research program. We are available on Omni.fm, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Spotify. Please follow or subscribe to the On Diversity podcast to get notified when we have a new episode. You can visit our website ipscommons.sg for more info.